Kaba, I beg your pardon, just to go ahead and have a discussion on what we have seen today. And of course, the big story is that this declaration for the G20 it was adopted as early as midday today. Probably something we have not seen in previous G20 leader summits. So let me bring in Hlumelo into this conversation. Hlumelo, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon to you, Firaz, and thank you very much for having me.
Hlumelo, the adoption happening at so early within this leader summit, I must confess, I was shocked by it because I thought, okay, don't have the United States of America. You're hearing this rhetoric coming out of Washington, D.C. saying no one's going to take this recommendation. But today has proved completely opposite.
Well, honestly speaking, I think I'll echo what you said, that it's very unprecedented. And I think this G20, in the manner and how it has unfolded, is very unprecedented. Firstly, you have the United States that is not present here, which is something that has never really happened before because they like take in terms of these forums. And now you also have the declaration being adopted and the commencement of the summit, which is something that would ordinarily happen after the deliberations are done, whereby everyone, all the member states actually sign and adopt the declaration. So I do believe that President Cyril Ramaphosa and his cohort may have tried to actually do or maybe counter, because they may have foreseen certain things in how they are going to unfold, because we do know that a declaration is only adopted once all the member states have given their inputs insofar with towards climate change, and even things such as combating illicit trade and financing, which are part of the things that are part of the agenda, by the way. So now this time around, we actually see the declaration being adopted in the commencement of the conference. I think also another thing that we can look at is the fact that President Cyril Ramaphosa appears to be very less timid in so far as his posture is concerned, because one thing that I always say is that South Africa has a very timid geopolitical posture, because sometimes it wants to align with certain allies or forces within the geopolitical landscape, and sometimes it actually takes a very non-alignment position. So I think this time around we can actually see President Cyril Ramaphosa, in contrast to previous times whereby he was critiqued, actually asserting and stamping his authority as the chair of this G20. So I think that one of the things that the adoption of the declaration in the commencement of the conference actually signifies that President Cyril Ramaphosa is really actually trying to show everyone that he is in charge and that everything is going to go in the manner in how South Africa wants, but obviously also trying to take into cognizance the views of other member states as well.
Something interesting that you mentioned, the way in which President Cyril Ramaphosa has conducted his G20 to the start of the year, when of course the SANDF soldiers were killed by the M23 rebels, Paul Kagame of Rwanda. We're thinking, all right, there's going to be a diplomatic spat between Rwanda, Kigali, South Africa, Pretoria. You've got President Cyril Ramaphosa handling it in an effective manner. Then, of course, you've got AfriForum who goes to the White House, and there's this development coming from US President Donald Trump that this so-called white genocide that is happening, which has been proven false on numerous occasions. President Cyril Ramaphosa deals with it in a very... Then, of course, the visit to the White House, which I feel was meant to be a trap for the president. He comes out there unscathed. There's something different about President Ramaphosa, isn't there? And I agree with you on the critique that may have been there for him. But the way this has been handled within the 1 year, I think there has to be a sense of praise that goes towards it, because no one would have really have thought of this actually happening. But he has proven otherwise. And what I also like about what you say is that the fact that because he had this G20 presidency, I do feel a sense of, you know what? We're going to do this recommendation and adoption, and it doesn't have to come from the United States, who thinks the world revolves around Washington, D.C.
Well, honestly speaking, in as much as certain people may beg to differ on a domestic level.
Yeah, I think the domestic level, there is a bit of challenges there, and I would agree with you. There is a bit of critique that needs to be there. But I think globally, it's a different story.
Yes, which is something that I was about to get to. That on a domestic level, people may actually critique President Ramaphosa's responsiveness to pertinent issues. For instance, the issue of GBV, whereby a lot of people were actually decrying how he has been so silent, even in issues pertaining to unemployment and crime, for that matter. But I think on a geopolitical front, he has actually been quite commendable insofar as how he has handled certain geopolitical issues. For instance, you mentioned the issue of the M23 rebels and the, I would say, almost tension that actually transpired between South Africa and Rwanda, but even that actually subsided because of the manner in how he was so not proactive in a way, but in the manner in how he was so calm and how he handled it diplomatically. And then fast forward to what happened at the White House, or the tension, and also the comment, or rather, let me just say that where the tensions emanated from in regards to South Africa and the US. You'll remember that every forum went there, even the Democratic Alliance is said to have went there, which resulted in the firing of Deputy Minister of Trade and Industry, Andrew Whitfield. But amid everything, he didn't really react in a manner that was urgent. As a matter of fact, I thought President Ramaphosa is not acting with the urgency that all of these issues deserve, because the US is our second largest trading partner, and you would expect a president to actually be very hasty in how he deals with such issues. But I think that he was actually very strategic in what he gives attention to in regards to the bilateral relations between South Africa and the US. And if you can notice, even when he went to the White House, he was a lot of people expected people to actually make a mockery of him and, for lack of a better term, mop the floor like Trump did with Zelensky. But he went there with his delegation very calm, and on hindsight, actually, I think he handled the situation quite well. And as much as we can actually disagree that no, he made a mockery of himself and all of that, but I think for someone that is very calm, he handled it very well, as opposed to someone who would be very irrational, knowing how President Trump is. So I think in terms of who the advisory body or whoever's advising him, as far as handling geopolitical tensions with the US is concerned, but also geopolitical or bilateral relations with other member states of the the G20, as well as other states.
Shomelo, that press conference that's playing right now on the screen, there's a concept that Africa needs to lead. Now, since the post-colonial era, Africa has been seen this sort of charitable case, which I feel is a disgraceful way of looking at Africa, a mockery to what Africa presents to the world. And I think both you and I can agree, as people of the soil, that Africa has everything the world would envy. We've got everything, from the oil to the gold to the timber to the cocoa, anything you can imagine. What we are not seeing is Africa taking control or having their place within the economy. I'm listening to the especially the Global North delegation. They truly believe that Africa must take the lead. Can that happen? Can the Global North give the space for the Global South to determine how its economies must work?
Well, just to corroborate what you said just now in regards to Africa having a lot of minerals and everything like that, President Ramaphosa actually alluded to that in one of his priorities, that we need to harness our critical minerals. What Africa, or even South Africa for that matter, usually do in these platforms is that they use the minerals which we know aren't really available or aren't in abundance in the Global North as a bargaining tool to actually get what we want. For instance, even in the meeting that took place at the White House, one of the things that President Ramaphosa alluded to was that we have critical minerals in South Africa. And also, just to go off track, even Minister Gwede Mandashe, at the time the tensions were simmering, he actually said that the US can do whatever it wants, but we'll keep our minerals. So you can actually see how much minerals we have in abundance and how much we actually use our minerals as a bargaining tool on a global platform. However, I do think that Africa is being exploited. We do know that there is some form of, for lack of a better term, revolution that some people have said in the Sahel region, where we see Niger actually taking control of its minerals.
Burkina Faso.
Burkina Faso
Yeah,
taking
yeah.
control of its minerals. Even Namibia now, whereby President Nandi is actually trying to take control of the mineral complex. Even Botswana, for that matter. So there's this revolution that we are seeing, whereby Africa is now trying or attempting to actually regain its sovereignty across all spectrums, economically as well as politically. But it shouldn't go unsaid that a lot of the Western countries or global global North countries are actually using the tension between the US and South Africa as an opportunity to come and gratify their interests, because we know that the EU, for instance, in the EU South Africa summit earlier on in the year, committed to invest an amount of about 4.7 billion euros development and pharmaceuticals, and this happened in the wake of the US withdrawing its PEPFAR funding, which is related to pharmaceuticals. So you can already see that a lot of these Western countries or Western powers have a lot of interest, and for as long as that is the case, it, even though that may happen, but it shouldn't lead to sovereignty.
Okay, I think we're going to be going now to the stage. Oh, wait. Well, we're going to be Deputy Minister of International Relations, I beg your pardon, Ronald Lamola is going ahead and giving he's going to be deliberating his speech there. So I think regards to this. So I think Hlomulo, you mentioned the European Union, right? What's interesting about that is that when PEPFAR, the withdrawal of PEPFAR started, this whole shenanigans with AfriForum had occurred. Who steps up and says, South Africa, we're not going to abandon you, the European Union? And I'm thinking, you know what? There could be some sort of shift in the way we look at the global systems and just how things are being done. And I think for me, that was quite a huge change in the way things, your take on it, Hlomulo, the way this thing has changed.
Well, I think currently now we know that the global order is very anarchic in that there isn't a system whereby we can say this is what happens. People conduct their bilateral relations the way they think. But what seems to be at play here is that the US isn't coming to terms with the fact that their position as a global superpower is slowly becoming dismantled, and the EU is actually trying to show that we also have the muscle that the United States has. Even China, for that matter, is actually trying to show that we have the muscle and the capability that the US has, because there are actually, it is alleged that China would offer South Africa a duty-free goods or trade insofar as the goods that are going there in the wake of the 30% tariff. So all of these things, that's actually go to show that the US is there's this attempt to slowly dismantle the US's position as a global superpower. The fact that the EU was quick to come and fill in the void that was left by the US does tell us that there is a shift in the global political order.
They all open, they all close, but not all doors are made the same. Some are built to last, some are crafted to impress. At Olive Doors, every door is designed with purpose, precision in every edge, beauty in every grain. Because your door shouldn't just open a space, it should make an impression. Olive Doors, quality, reliable over 30 years.
Welcome to Busy Corner Meat Hyper, where our prices never mistake and our quality meets your expectations. Looking for the prime cuts for your family dinners? Our selection is rare and ready to go. We're chopping prices so you can have more for less. So steer your way to Busy Corner Meat Hyper and carve out the best for your table. Busy Corner Meat Hyper, where people meet.
Looks like Steven's all over the place. Perhaps it's time to share my secret.
Meal in a glass, perfect for your go-getter lifestyle. High in energy, protein, omega-3, 26 vitamins and minerals. Isn't it time you shake up your day the Replace way? Replace Junior, packed with nutrients to optimize growth and development, immune and brain function. The delicious meal in a glass, loved by kids on the go.
You'll find us in small towns and busy suburbs. Each pharmacy a little different.
But no matter where we are part of the same Ring Farm family.
That's how we keep giving our customers a little extra.
More time,
More care.
More heart. It's not just a pharmacy.
It's something personal.
Ring Farm.
that little bit extra.
Hlumelo, again, thank you so much for staying with us. Hlumelo is a governance and political analyst. Hlumelo, I want to touch on, I think, South Africa's role from a diplomatic perspective. So back in April, Vladimir Zelensky had come here, and there was a term that was being thrown around by many international relations analysts, South Africa as an honest broker. Now, I found it to be quite a juxtaposition, because obviously South Africa has these close ties with Russia due to BRICS, and I think there's obviously a historical aspect to all of this. But South Africa was willing to listen to Vladimir Zelensky. There was tons of international pressure from South Africa, from many political the country, that South Africa has sided with Russia. But I'd like to think what we saw in April kind of changed things, didn't it?
Well, I think I'll go back to what I said, that South Africa likes maintaining or likes really posturing itself as being timid diplomacy and geopolitical the geopolitical landscape, because what I mentioned earlier on, that South Africa is a member of BRICS, yet it wants to fraternize with the US, it wants to fraternize with Ukraine, for instance. So that in a way actually makes other global powers or action where South Africa really stands. For instance, even in the Russia-Ukraine war, they say that they're taking a non-alignment position. They're a member of BRICS. It would be expected of them to stand with Russia, which is also a developing state, as opposed to actually siding with Russia. But what I've actually come to notice as well is that South Africa, in that instance, took more of a peacemaker role, even in as far as the Gaza and Palestine, Israel war is concerned. In as much as we took Israel to the ICJ, but I do feel like it's actually in relation to ensuring that there is justice in that whole process. So it goes back to what I was saying, that South Africa likes to maintain a very timid position, but also one that actually ensures that there's justice and that there will be peace. So in as much as our role is very timid and also makes us very questionable to other global actors, but I think it's because we are able to align with everyone for our own benefit.
And I think even with the way he deals with many of the conflicts that we see in Africa right now, I think especially when you see the civil war that's happening in Sudan, and I think it's quite interesting what is happening there. It's because no one really knows that civil war actually has gone. You've heard various human rights organizations saying that what the RSF is doing obviously constitutes, war crimes in the Al-Fasher region. But South Africa, I think, taken quite an unaligned position in there. And I think because the African Union sees South Africa as quite its strategic partner, a more brotherly partnership, given that it's from the African continent, that's important. I want to ask you, Hlumelo, on the African continent, the African Union, there have been critiques with regards to them. There have been questions the Union has really conducted itself, especially with conflicts within the African continent. What is your take on that? Is the African Union evolving as this continental bloc? We have seen nations pulling out, for example, in the Sahel region. So I just wanted to get your take on that.
Well, as things stand, the African Union's effectiveness insofar as handling conflict as well as regime changes in some of the regions of the African continent is very questionable, because, for instance, we've had elections being rigged. You saw what happened in Mozambique last year, where there was an uprising against Daniel Chapo.
Yes, yeah.
People were in favor of Venancio Mondlane. In such instances, you would expect a body like the African Union to intervene. There's even an observer mission when it comes to elections, which is supposed to actually come in and observe, or rather maybe detect what the problem is. The African Union is supposed to play a more problem solver role insofar as continental issues are concerned, even with the issues that are happening in neighboring countries such as Zimbabwe, for that matter. We saw what happened in Tanzania regarding elections, even the coups that have been happening in the Sahel region. But we have not had the African Union intervening in all of these instances. Sorry. We haven't had the African Union intervening in all of these instances. So that actually it actually puts not their legitimacy per se, but their credibility and their trustworthiness in question. Because, for instance, we know that the UN declared that there's a war that is happening, there's a genocide that is happening in Gaza as a result of a commission that they did. We would expect such a thing from a body like the African Union, whereby they actually synthesize a problem and actually make a pronouncement on what is happening, and following that, they actually act and have an interventionist role in everything that is happening in the continent. But we don't really see that, and we would also expect them to be sort of like a collective mouthpiece for all the member states of the African Union. But instead, we see South Africa being a mouthpiece of the African continent and the global South in a way. Like you said, that South Africa is a very strategic country.
Hlumelo, what's interesting, I would like to think that when you saw the withdrawal of the Sahel countries, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, what we saw was them pulling out of the African Union. And I thought to myself, okay, so even if you are within the African continent and you've established that, I think they were also part of ECOWAS, if I stand to be correct, right? And I'm just asking myself, right, okay, if they can do that, there is questions with regards to how the African Union functions in terms of accountability. Now, my concern with regards to this is that who's going to hold them to account if, God forbid, a war crime happens within these countries or something occurs which would have African Union accountability on these countries? What is your take on that? Has that weakened the African Union, or has the African Union said, look, there's not much that can be done. They've done what they've done. They have their own path. They're within the African continent, and we just have to deal with it. Your take on that, Hlumelo?
Well, I think what you're saying just goes to confirm the fact that the African Union's effectiveness has credibility to question because of everything that has been happening. I mean, if you have countries of a particular region withdrawing en masse, that should actually tell you of the fact that there's no center that is holding within the African Union. As some politicians have even gone on to say that it's a gentleman's club because of the manner in how it approaches conflict and certain things that they're supposed to take an interventionist role in. So I do think that what is currently happening is the African Union does somewhat lack some form of authoritarianism, not a dictatorship, but remember, such bodies are bodies that are supposed to allow people to join freely, are bodies that are supposed to protect their member states and intervene in times of conflict, and also act as mouthpieces, like I said, on the global or geopolitical landscape. But you don't see that from the African Union. Instead, we see the different member states fighting their own battles and unilaterally deciding what they want to do without even consulting or getting consensus from the African Union. So I think that is very the African Union is supposed to play a bit more oversight role as well as an interventionist role in issues pertaining conflict and regime changes that are undemocratic in the continent.
Let's look at locally SADC. How do you see SADC really playing its role? Is there, you've of course got the SADC missions that are happening at this very moment. South Africa, it's quite clear that out of the SADC regions, we are the strongest. I think that's as obvious as you can get. But how do you see SADC evolving, or its relevancy, and South Africa's role within it?
Well, like you mentioned, that South Africa, not only within SADC but in the continent, is a mouthpiece. Hence, we even have the G20 being hosted here. It just goes to show the gravitas that South Africa holds within SADC and the continent as a whole. But I think that the fact that SADC, South Africa, is the largest, I would say, economy or the most powerful country in SADC, in a way does create problems for us domestically as a country, because we must remember that in any region of the world, what you will have, if you have a country that is more developed than others, will result in an influx of people in neighboring countries coming to that country seeking greener pastures, which is witnessing in South Africa. The phenomenon that you're witnessing in America, where you find Mexicans and people from Ecuador and other countries in flooding the United States. So I just think that that also actually goes back to the fact that there is no incoherence insofar as the African Union is concerned, and even SADC. You would expect a lot of collegiality and well as coherence between these different countries, because one thing that we should also actually take note of is the fact that we remember there was a Liberation Movement Summit that happened, which was hosted by the ANC in South Africa, which actually brought liberation movement from this region, such as SWAPO in Namibia, Frelimo in Mozambique, and ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. But South Africa does not call out these neighboring countries when conflict or whatever is happening there transpires. We look at what was happening in Zimbabwe. You look at what was happening in 2023, where opposition leaders were being jailed. South Africa, as the most developed state within this region, is also supposed to call some of these countries out for their behavior, particularly considering the fact that for the longest of time the ANC was the ruling party in South Africa, and also movement in the continent. So you would expect that South Africa actually cracks the whip on their neighboring countries, but we haven't seen that. Instead, what we see is President Ramaphosa congratulating Daniel Chapo, congratulating Emerson Mnangagwa, congratulating...
I want to come in there, Hlumelo. And this is interesting, I was discussing with Dr. Imran Burkas, is that politics within liberation movements, is it outdated? Let me ask you why. Because we saw last year's elections, the African National Congress dropped to 44%. And its hand was forced into taking a government of national unity. Obviously, in other democracies, in other countries within the SADC region that have liberation movements, they don't have the same luxury we have. We have this constitution. Many can argue whether it's strong or not. I'd like to think that what we saw last year, we had a strong IEC, Electoral Commission, and we had a strong constitution. Governance was strong, which allowed for this government of national unity to occur. And yet, when you see what's happening in Zimbabwe, when you see these crazy results for these liberation movements, I'm thinking to myself, ability being held. Now, the ANC will say, by brotherly affection, due to our relationship with the fellow liberation movements, we are obligated to support them. But surely there has to be a change in that, because if it's happening where the constitution of these respective countries are being undermined, that really, for me, is not a good state. And I think South Africa needs to look at, actually the African National Congress needs to take a hard look at itself when it comes to that. And because as an ANC member in the International Relations Department, hey, the world is looking at the ANC, and hence they'll go to say, what are you guys doing in terms of holding these countries accountable, especially when it comes to election times?
Well, I always make the argument that South Africa, compared to its neighboring countries, is a model or a benchmark of how democracy ought to be. Because one of the things I always say is that you know that ZANU-PF has been in power in Zimbabwe for close to 4 decades, if not more than that. Frelimo as well has been in power for 4 decades, if not more. Even SWAPO, at least SWAPO got like their independence. Namibia got its independence after South Africa in 1994. But one of the things that I always say is that the only reason why the ANC's power or exit or decline was expedited is because of the high level of democracy that we have in South Africa. What I can assure you of is if Zimbabwe and even some neighboring countries embodied the same level of democratic principles, ZANU-PF would be out of power by now.
As early as 2000, I think so. As early as 2000, yes.
Frelimo would be out of power by now. But I just think that I agree with what you're saying, that the ANC, not only in its, or rather, let me just say South Africa, because we always see South Africa as the ANC, South Africa as an extension of the fact that they've been a leading figure in our domestic politics. I think that I agree with you when you're saying that they need to take a more leading role and take a look at itself, that are we actually doing justice by allowing what is transpiring in Mozambique, what is transpiring in Tanzania, what is transpiring in Zimbabwe perpetually occur. Because another thing we also need to take a note of is that these liberation movements relationship didn't only start now. It started way back in the 1960s. There was a point in time where, for instance, South Africa, or let me just say Umkhonto Sizwe at that time, actually got refuge in Julius Nyerere, even under Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia. So these relations, or ties rather, have a historical precedence, which is something I believe is a problem with all liberation movements, whereby they actually, or loyalty is actually more than logic and other things.
You know, Shlomello, what's interesting about this? I'm going to go to, for example, Palestine within the West Bank Covenant. So the PLO obviously morphed into, various of its members morphed into the Palestinian Authority. Now the Palestinian Authority was just seen as also one where many Palestinians before saying that they're not happy with the way the Palestinian Authority is governing the West Bank, because Hamas was obviously as a political party, had won the elections of Palestine, but obviously Western influence said that this should not happen. So we've just got 2 minutes, Shlomello. I'm going to get your final closing remarks, and we hope we can speak to you again tomorrow. As we wrap up day 1, I would like to think that today was a victory for multilateralism. Are you agreeing with that statement?
No, I fully agree with that. I fully agree with that, because I'll just go back to what we initially alluded on in this discussion, where we said that it assumes the role of a big brother and that nothing can go on without them being present. But they're not actually realizing, or they may be in denial of the fact that there's a shift in the global order. Like developing countries, which actually have the muscle, the economic muscle and the diplomatic muscle that they also have, are actually rising to the fore now. So I think that today was a victory for multilateralism. And another thing that I'd also like to add as I close is the fact that a lot of the member states that are present at this summit are very cooperative with South Africa, and they're very receptive to President Ramaphosa's chairmanship of this G20 presidency of South Africa also. But one thing that I'd also like to see is South Africa using this opportunity as something to leveraging this opportunity towards developing or ventilating some of our challenges domestically and continentally, hoping that whatever it is that is going to be deliberated on, be it investment, climate change, will benefit the continent, not only the continent, but not only South Africa, but the continent as a whole, because this is for the first time where we're having a platform of this magnitude being in our continent. So I do think that South Africa, in these deliberations or bilateral meetings that are going to happen, should leverage this opportunity and exploit the opportunity of actually attracting investors and also ensuring that they don't compromise their sovereignty in that whole process.
Hlumelo, we hope to speak to you tomorrow again. Thank you so much for joining us here on day one on our broadcast here on Hilal TV. Much appreciated.
You're welcome.
That's Hlumelo Kaba. He is a governance and political analyst. Do stay tuned. We'll have more for you on Umzansi Welcomes to coming up after this break.